Say, did you watch the Randy Savage biography, by the way? That's a question.
I did, because I was going to watch it later in the week, but I spoke to this guy that said, people are really pissed at you for not watching the biography last week. And I didn't know anyone had this reaction. So I did indeed watch the Randy Savage one.
Well, it was on Twitter last week. The people were dismayed that I watched the show and spoke about the show, but you had forgotten the show was on, and some even chastised you for not going back to the on-demand service or whatever. So I suggest this week we should talk while it's timely, and I especially wanted to see what you thought of it, because of the various things that I thought of it. And the biggest one is, honestly, before we talk about the Randy Savage biography on A&E, we ought to talk about the Poffo family's wrestling promotion, ICW, because if you watched the Randy Savage biography on A&E, you don't know what the fuck it was, do you? Could you figure out what, from how they described their family promotion, what the fuck it actually was, where it was, and what was going on?
It was just a family business that expanded outward from wherever they were located. And I will say, too, I noticed that Vince used to use it, and now Bruce is using it, the word fiefdom. All these promoters had their fiefdoms all around the country, you see.
So somebody said on Twitter, why were they calling it thiefdoms? Were they saying that all the promoters were thieves? Fief, F-I-E-F, right. Fiefdom. In the old days, that was a tiny little fiefdom, an island unto itself, a self-ruled whatever. But that was another problem I had, and I said this last week with Steve Austin. It was easy. He started in Texas. It was in kind of Memphis concurrently for a short period of time. Went to WCW and then WWF. With Piper, even though it was more complicated, they still took a more chronological tone, even though, as I mentioned, they conflated Georgia and Mid-Atlantic and skipped over Crockett, his name and his company whatsoever, even though they were using the footage. He was never mentioned, which was a big part of Roddy's career. But in this case, basically Randy gets hurt and can't make it in baseball and turns to the family business, which apparently was their own promotion, and the first 5 years of his career never happened, and he's in ICW, and then we don't really know what the fuck that was. And all we know was that Lawler said, yeah, they were really talking about a match that was never going to take place. It was was it confusing unless you knew the story to most people of what was going on there?
I think if you're a flighty viewer, you kind of are just watching it and not picking up on things. If you're a kid who's obsessed with wrestling and you're trying to follow along, it's going to be hard to figure out the exacts.
Yeah.
Who, what, when, where, why. The word outlaw never used.
Well, since you don't know a brief history of Savage's early years, since you don't know if you watched the biography, yes, what was it, 74? He started working, because that was, I think, the year that 74, 75. And obviously it was the family business, because Angelo Poffo had been a wrestler and was his father. And also it was, this is where it's going to get complicated. And this is another reason why they can't do it in 2 hours anyway. Before Angelo and Lanny and Randy started International Championship Wrestling, ICW, in 1979, Angelo Poffo had been an investor in literally almost exactly the same geographic territory in 1972 and 73 when Phil Golden tried to run opposition to the Gulas Welch office and Jerry Jarrett. And they saw the same thing that Jerry Jarrett had seen in 1970. There was a strip of towns that were dark, basically following across Interstate 64 from southern Illinois over into West Virginia, Louisville and Lexington and Evansville. And when Jarrett opened those up, then Phil Golden a couple of years later was able to get TV out in Paducah, Kentucky, which is in far western Kentucky and right next to southern Illinois. Angelo Poffo lived in Illinois at that time. He's from Chicago, Downers Grove, etc. And he wasn't being used by any of the NWA offices or traditional offices, but he got in with Phil Golden and was an early investor and was one of their top heels. And they'd try to make a go of it all the way from Paducah and southern Illinois, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, all the way through Louisville, Lexington, and into West Virginia. Stephen P. New probably remembers some of that from his childhood. And that only lasted a year or two. But then several years later, Randy got into business, and Randy and Angelo and Lanny had worked for the Sheik in Detroit. And they'd also worked they skipped over Tennessee, and the Waffle House story would have been a good one. Where Randy and the Police Dog went 2 out of 3 falls at the Waffle House in Nashville. But Randy and Lanny had both worked for Goulas and worked on top for quite some time. That's when he was having matches with Dutch Mantell and Bobby Eaton for the Mid-America title. And that's where he had really become the first time he had become a main event guy and started using the Macho Man gimmick. And then they all got booked up in the Maritimes. Was it Halifax for, oh, God damn it. It was Emile Dupree, right? They spent some time up there.
I think so.
In late 78, early 79, and that's where, early 79, because that's where they got the idea to come back. And Angelo, the reason why Angelo's gimmick when in ICW was the miser was not only because he facially looked older, but he was in incredible physical shape, so they put a mask on him, but also because that was Angelo. He was a fucking miser. I've heard Rip Rogers tell stories. He would limit the times that he washed his clothes because he didn't want the detergent to break down the fibers and cause the clothes to wear out quicker. So Angelo Poffo had some money, and they came back and started a promotion that they were going to run in some of the same cities across this I-64 corridor in Kentucky and over in West Virginia, and called it ICW, International Championship Wrestling. And when they first did television in Lexington at old Channel 62, they used a match that Lanny had with Randy in Halifax on March 13, 1979, as when he won the ICW World title. And they did incredibly low-budget television at Channel 62, where the first time, I think the first day they taped, they did like 8 or 10 shows, and nobody even knew that it was a thing that existed. So they had literally some of the underneath guys and a few station employees, wives, girlfriends, whatever, sitting in the crowd and used the cardboard cutout thing of people past the first row. But they got TV in Lexington and down in eastern Kentucky, I think on the Hazard Station, probably had it over in West Virginia for a while, eventually got it in Louisville. What doomed them in Louisville was that Fox 41 wanted to counter program against the Wave 3 Jarrett wrestling show that was doing monster numbers, so they put it on at 11:30 to 12:30, thinking that the wrestling fans would stick with it. And instead, everybody saw 30 minutes of ICW and then changed over to Channel 3. But they were always running more Eastern Kentucky stuff than Jarrett ran. They were always running towns like Frankfort, Kentucky, that Jarrett wouldn't go to because, to be honest, it never drew. But they always wanted to get to Memphis especially, and they did early on a couple of times at the Cook Convention Center, but you couldn't in 1979. Later on in 1980, they were a little bit more vulnerable when Lawler was out with a broken leg, but they could never get TV in Memphis that anybody would pay attention to and get a foothold into running that town. They ran Louisville a number of times at the Commonwealth Convention Center downtown and didn't do any business because the Gardens was running every Tuesday night. And that was, like I said, mostly especially when they got to 81 and 82, when Lawler came back and business was booming, that ran ICW further over into Eastern Kentucky, where they were more unopposed, and they did some good houses. They used to run Manchester, Kentucky, and because they didn't have a building at one point in Manchester that they could have any kind of wrestling matches in. This fan named Ernie Couch said, "Why can't you come to Manchester? Bring the matches to Manchester. We don't have a building. We can't run." He actually put up one of those pole barns in his backyard that they could seat like 400 or 500 people in or whatever, so that they would bring matches and they would advertise it, "If we're coming to Manchester, at Ernie Couch's place." And that's how they'd advertise the matches, and they ran it regularly. And then later on, when he added, I guess, like pinball machines and a fucking jukebox, they started calling it Ernie Couch's Entertainment Center. But the thing early on, if they could have gotten television, maybe they'd have had a chance because they had so much more talent. If they could have gotten strong TV and gotten buildings and had a little bit more of a budget at the start, ICW was the Pafos promotion they started. But at the same time that they're trying to run opposite Jarrett in Louisville and Lexington up here, that was when, and you know from the Ron Fuller's Studcast, the guys split off from Ron's Southeastern in Knoxville and started All-Star Wrestling in 1979 also. And that was Bob Roop, Bob Orton Jr., Ronnie Garvin, Boris Malenko. And those were big, major veteran names in wrestling. But suddenly they've started running opposition because they were trying to do the same thing. They thought they could be the owners and the promoters and they could take over the territory. That's where the money was.
Don't forget Ron Wright.
And Ron Wright, who actually had been an owner in Kingsport, and Ron he didn't get involved with ICW because he didn't want to travel. So he was helping them run All-Star against Ron Fuller in East Tennessee. But then somehow they had a parley. They had a parley, and suddenly the Pafos started working with the Outlaws in Knoxville, and they were working on each other's shows. Except that's why Ron Wright never actually came up and did ICW television or did their house shows up here. And so, but at the time, think about this. On television, Lanny was a heck of a worker back then. Nobody had seen him, but he was first one to do the moonsault and all that other shit. Randy Savage, who was incredible in the ring and had just started doing the Macho Man promos, and it was like his real raw best stuff, and you could get away with saying anything on this program. Bob Orton Jr., one of the best workers in the business. Ronnie Garvin. Garvin at that time was not, the clean boots and the tights and the hands of stone from the mid-'80s in Crockett and the, blonde crew cut. He was almost 10 years younger. He'd always been a tag team guy. He'd never been a main event singles guy. But in Knoxville, they got him over because he bled and he could fight and he was a tough guy. And he did the fucking brawling shit and the crazy angles. He threw the fucking title belt off the Gay Street Bridge. And people thought he was nuts and thought he was a badass, which he was, both cases. And so he got over first as a heel. And that's when Andre came in, and Andre sold for him and let Ronnie Garvin, French Canadians, stick together. Ronnie Garvin kicked shit out of Andre the Giant in Knoxville. So then when he switched babyface, he was a top guy. That was his best run as a single in his career.
And he was the biggest star out of all of them in that area.
In that area, he was the biggest star. At Boris Malenko, of course, had been a legend in Florida. He was on the tail end of his in-ring career. Roop was a shooter, but he had been everywhere, but not ever a top guy. But point is, you've got those guys on that TV show, plus Rip Rogers. Savage had met Rip Rogers when they were working for Nick. I think Rip was there at the Waffle House. And Rip kind of idolized Savage and wanted to learn the business. He was a rookie at that point, but he was a bodybuilder. And all those guys were in great shape. Of course, some of the guys that worked for Jarrett used to joke that that's all they had to do was go to the gym because they weren't employed anywhere where they were making any fucking money. But Rip was a good young talent, and they were, at that point, they had all those top guys, but then the rest of the card fell off bad. because then they were having to use local outlaws. And after a while, they started training some guys, and they developed their own guys. Doug Vines and Jeff Sword were a pretty solid tag team, worked a few places. With their manager, Izzy Slapowitz. The Devil's Duo was Vines and Sword, and they had Izzy Slapowitz, who was what? Help me with the terminology. The Jewish folks in the Northeast there that have the curly hair.
He was supposed to be a Hasidic Jew, but his real name, I think, was what? Jeff Smith.
Yeah. But he would talk like this. This is Izzy Slapowitz and the Devil's Duo. And, me and Heenan didn't necessarily have anything to worry about, but he was fun, right? And they came up with Crusher Broomfield, who would later become the one-man gang. And that was Ronnie Garvin's nickname, actually, in Knoxville, was the one-man gang, Ronnie Garvin. But before George Gray became gang, he was Crusher Broomfield. He was 6'5" or whatever and 350 pounds. But he reminded everybody of Crusher Blackwell because when you would see him in those early TVs, they'd shoot him off and he'd take the forward bump and the buckle and go over the top and fucking take a big bump, which for a guy that size and you'd never heard of, you could tell he was going to be a star, but then he was still green. But like I said, they had either guys that were on the way up, guys that were on the way out, or in some cases, some other guys that just got caught up and couldn't get booked by the territories because they were on the wrong side of the established promotions for one side or the other, or one reason or the other. But they lasted from 1979 until fall of 83. And we've covered this on the show when we talked about Dundee leaving Memphis and going to Mid-South Wrestling to become the booker. It may have been that Savage, now that we're looking at these shows, had a spot to go work for Bill Watts when they folded their company up. But instead, when he found out Dundee was going to be the booker, he turned around and deviated and went to Memphis, and they were able to finally have the matches that they'd been promoting. And that was touched on in the biography also. From the start, another thing that was always said was they spent more time cutting promos on matches they weren't going to have against Jarrett's guys than they did to get their own talent over. And to be honest with you, it wouldn't have mattered. They had good in-ring talent. I don't know who was booking during all those years, but fucking Eddie Graham didn't have anything to worry about. A fan's perception of that show at that time was that we could take low budget because at least we watch anything regarding wrestling, right? But even though the talent was great, and you're having these matches with Randy Savage against Lanny Poffo and Bob Orton Jr. and Boris Malenko against this guy and that guy on television, it's great work. But these guys, it was the fans' assumption was that all these guys were in this obviously second-rate promotion because they were probably all crazy and on drugs, because that's what they looked like, that's what they talked like, and sometimes that's what the angles were booked like. And it wasn't going to beat the established promotion with the names that the people knew, for everybody from Lance Russell to Jerry Lawler to Bill Dundee to Austin Idol to Jimmy Valiant to whatever, and especially all the huge names that Jarrett would bring in, and the world title matches, whether it be NWA, AWA, whatever. They at one point, ICW would use the Sheik and his guys in the dying days of, the Detroit promotion, and the Sheik, because they had started there, Randy and Lanny, because Sheik and Angelo Poffo were old friends. So you'd have the Sheik defending the U.S. title on an ICW show against Ox Baker in 1983. Can you imagine what that looked like? While there's, Jerry Lawler in the main event on the other promotion with Austin Idol or Stan Hansen and Jimmy Valiant or whatever the fuck, and it wasn't going to work. But it got heated enough, and they had a brief allusion to this. We've told the story that Lexington was where all the ICW guys lived, and Jarrett ran Rupp Arena there once a month. So, and that's where the ICW guys were taping their television. So all the promos, especially, were on Randy Savage saying, if Jerry Lawler will face me in such and such time, then I'll put up $100,000, which everybody knew they didn't have $100,000. They didn't have $10,000 probably. Again, all he has to bring is a ham sandwich. Or he would challenge Dundee, Jarrett, and Tojo Yamamoto when Tojo wasn't even figured in, just because that was a Jarrett name. 3-on-1 with $100,000 going to charity if he or whatever the fuck. And people knew these matches were not going to take place, but they were the biggest part of their newspaper ads and TV shows. So finally, Rupp Arena calls Christine Jarrett and said they've gotten word that some of the ICW wrestlers have bought ringside tickets and they're going to be there. And so they had extra security and they wouldn't let them in the building. So then they started a couple of shows, 2 or 3 shows in a row. The ICW guys would stand out back when the Memphis wrestlers would pull up in the parking lot and go in the back area. And that it's been developed since then. That's been 40 years ago. So there's a huge parking area, but back then it was a little tighter. So instead of causing any controversy or confrontation out in the parking lot, Rupp Arena started letting all the guys pull in and park inside the building because it's a huge complex. So the ICW guys would be out there trying to start shit, and the Memphis guys wouldn't have to get out of their car. They'd pull right in the building. But all the guys brought their guns because the boys believed, and probably rightfully so, that most of the guys working ICW were either impaired or crazy or both. And so they weren't taking any chances. And especially after the thing happened with Savage and Dundee at the gym in Nashville. And Dundee ended up with a broken jaw. And gunplay was involved. So they couldn't stir anything up there because Rupp Arena wouldn't put them over and got security to keep them away. So it was a constant harassment. And that's where I got plenty of lectures from Teeny on the Outlaws. But finally, when they had to close up, all those promos ended up working in a way, but it made money for Jerry Jarrett rather than the Poffo family, because then when they apologize and can we work together, and they bring Savage in to have the one-on-one at Rupp Arena in Lexington with Lawler, they drew over 8,000 people in Lexington, Kentucky.
Although on the biography special, when they said the match was in Lexington, it was in the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis.
Well, yeah, that was another thing I was going to mention. They identified it as Lexington. That was the Mid-South. There is no tape of the match in Lexington because they didn't bring the camera to Lexington that week or that month. But little misleading things like that. But so I guess and then, what was it? By 81, Malenko retired at that point, and he was pretty much done in the ring and went back to Florida to start training people.
And run Outlaw. I mean, that's the other thing.
Yeah.
Everyone involved has a long history with different, I use the word outlaw, but you know what I mean, outlaw promotions. I mean, Angelo Poffo and Lanny, when Lanny was like right out of high school, they worked for Ann Gunkel. Obviously, you talked about the stuff he did previously. So, I mean, everyone kind of had a little, and Izzy Slapowitz came out of working for the Culkins, which was an outlaw group.
That's right.
A year earlier, 78?
Yeah, and that's where Troy Graham got started, 77, 78, working for the Culkins. And Kamala, Sugar Bear Harris.
Freebirds.
But Roop and Garvin obviously still had some cachet in the wrestling business, and Roop and Orton got back in, and Orton did too. Roop and Orton got back in by going to Mid-South. Where did Garvin go first?
Garvin, I think, went to Georgia because Ole, very similar to Watts, was willing to accept anyone, and Ole was in a more desperate position, whether he would acknowledge that or not, than Bill Watts was. So he just grabbed any talent he could. He didn't care about pissing people off.
But so that's by 81 or so, Orton and Roop and Garvin and Malenko had said, well, this is not going to work. So when they had left, that's when the next wave, moved up in ICW, and Pez Whatley was there for a long time. but it got weaker as they went on instead of stronger. And then, like I said, when they were bringing in Sheik and Ox Baker, I'm like, oh fuck, this is close to the end. So that
didn't Pez get back in through Georgia too?
Pez went back to Georgia. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. They all had. Rip Rogers went to Georgia. They all had to get back in the mainstream sooner or later. Well, not all of them. Some of them never did. That's why we're not talking about them. You don't know who they are. But they made it from, as I said, from 79 to the end of 83. But by that point, Randy had been in the business almost 10 years, and they really did. Well, it's a family business, and boy, they were mad at each other there down in our territory, and then boom, and then he goes to the WWF. So it was hard to follow all of that. It's probably hard to follow what we just said, but it was extra hard to follow all that. Although they did have some good ICW footage, including Angelo must save some of those masters because some of it looked good enough to be off the masters instead of VHS. But that show they even did an angle one time. I think it was involving Ronnie Garvin. Why wouldn't it have been? Where the heels put the baby face out by injecting them with a hypodermic. And this was in 1981. I'm going, what the fuck is going on here? Anyway.
ICW really was like the perfect storm of an outlaw promotion to run against. First Ron Fuller with All-Star, but then specifically Jerry Jarrett. Because even the little story, I mean, it wasn't here, but the story with Weingroff. Saul Weingroff falls out with the office all due to the relationship with Jerry Jarrett, who's in ICW, his son. George Weingroff.
George, yeah.
So now you have the Weingroffs involved with this. And again, when they were on the run trying to get out of town after the Bill Dundee incident in the parking lot, Saul Weingroff was working for the sheriff's department. Didn't he help them out getting out of town?
Well, wouldn't you know who won the pony? I don't want to finger anybody on that one. There's been several different stories told, but yeah, it just, it was a one-sided promotional war, but it was still bitter. There have been promotional wars that either didn't last long, like Jarrett and Nick Goulas's, and it was one-sided, or promotional wars like, Atlanta, All South, and the Georgia office, where it lasted for a while and it was close for a while and it was bitter, or Bruiser and Sheik, where it was bitter and it lasted for a while and it was really close. This is the only one I've ever can remember that lasted this long and was this bitter and was never even remotely close. That's the problem. It was like, what the fuck?
You know what I don't understand is exactly how Angelo Poffo ended up in this predicament. Because if you go back to the late 50s, early 60s, he's a big star. I mean, he's all over the Chicago magazines and programs. He's a pretty big star. Angelo Poffo and Bronco Lubitsch.
Yeah.
Everything he's doing. Chicago, he's a big star. And then, like you said, by the early 70s, he's doing these outlaw shows in Kentucky. I have some of the programs and they're drawn in marker. I mean, it's a real step down. How did that happen to Angelo Poffo? He was a pretty significant name. He always had the little thing of the Guinness Book record. But he went from being a pretty good-sized star in Chicago, a major market, to being someone who only worked outlaw shows the rest of his career.
Here's the thing, him being, and the show mentioned all the family was careful with their money, but him being a wrestler that long and knowing that being a promoter is where the big money was, I can see why he would have wanted to be in that position, but I don't know why he might have gotten into something, because, I mean, I saw Phil Golden's All-Star Wrestling first run on television. And it was actually the same kind of thing. You could tell this is clearly the folks that would like to be the top company rather than the top company. It was very small with not big names, but he was the top heel. But I don't know. But between the only established offices that Angelo or his family worked for until they made up with Jarrett in 84 for over a 10-year period were the Sheiks when he was working with more outlaws than against them. And Nick, when Nick had lost Jerry Jarrett and his crew, and all he was working with was the Sheik. Otherwise, it was all outlaw stuff.
Almost everyone else who worked for Gunkel came out of that promotion and had a job somewhere. I mean, the booker, Tom Ernesto, came out of that and was the booker for Georgia. But I mean, almost everyone who worked there later went on to have a career. It didn't hurt Ernie Ladd's career at all. It didn't really happen with them. They went outlaw. They stayed outlaw. Like you said, other than working with Nick for a while. And there was even footage of Randy Savage in a documentary on Nick Goulis's TV. But other than that, outlaw all the way. Which they would deny, but.
Well, anyway. So now that we've given everybody a brief history of ICW wrestling, should we actually talk about the biography special on Randy Savage? Because we've taken the piss out of the part that portrayed his early life. I was glad, like I said, on the show, I was glad to see that old ICW footage and some of the old Memphis footage, but it was, since they used it almost interchangeably and didn't identify what was Memphis and what wasn't, and they were there, most of, but not all of 1984 in Memphis working for Jarrett?
Well, Lanny came in a little bit after Randy because he was in Mid-South already for what was supposed to happen. Randy came in December 83. He left the spring of 85, so...
Okay, so a little over a year.
Yeah, a little over a year.
And they did some good stuff in that point. They didn't even show Randy pile driving Ricky Morton through the table in Memphis. The first one of those that everybody's had to imitate. So anyway, the early footage was somewhat jumbled. I was glad to see that they gave Pampero Firpo the nod for, oh yeah.
And what a weird, I shouldn't say it.
What?
I don't understand the relationship between Lanny and Randy, because even Lanny's like, I was afraid to speak to my brother. I never gave him any advice. I would never dare give him advice. And then one day he asked me for... And it's his brother. They've been growing up together. I've seen pictures of them as little kids together. It's not like all of a sudden he was dropped in with this crazy, wide-eyed, coked-up maniac. He's known the guy his whole life.
I'm just saying, the one point they made, and the point that I know from being around him a bit and just obviously watching so long, is Randy was fucking intense. And
did you
that
enjoy
was the thing?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, did you enjoy the Debbie Combs interview in this?
We'll get to the talking heads in a minute. But that was the highlight of watching ICW television, was watching the Randy Savage promos. And just the fact that this guy, regardless of what you think about the wrestling business or anything else, he's fucking nuts and you can't take your eyes off of him. And when he was coming, that was the early Macho Man before he ever even got to the WWF. Like we've said, with Piper, his best promos and in-ring stuff was in the Carolinas, maybe some in Portland. I think Savage's best in-ring stuff was in ICW/Memphis before he went to the W. I'm not talking about the most famous. I'm talking about when he was the youngest. He'd gotten experience. He'd become the Macho Man, but he hadn't had any injuries, and he still hadn't got heavy on the shit to bulk himself up for New York. That's when he was just amazing. Just like a fucking cat. But you would see this guy either on a promo or in the ring or whatever, and you'd go, he can't be a work. Nobody moves like that. Nobody acts like that. Nobody talks like that. Ooh, yeah. Guaranteed personified man. March 13, 1979, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Randy Macho Man Savage defeated Leapin' Lanny Poffo for the ICW World Heavyweight Championship. Dig it! What the fuck is it? And he would go on and on. So anyway,
the confetti was always a nice touch.
And he would bring the confetti out of his pocket. He had his own confetti.
That is still the best.
And we would hear the stories, and now I've had people say this. He was doing anything to get noticed. He got arrested one time for shoplifting a fucking round steak from the Kroger on New Circle Road in Lexington. and just shoved it down the front of his pants. It made the fucking papers. It wasn't as picturesque a story as the goddamn Waffle House thing.
But ICW announcer Tim Tyler told me that Randy did that for publicity. It was intentional. They talked about it beforehand.
And, you talk to some of the young ladies, formerly known as rats, who would say he lived in an apartment with just like a fucking weight bench and weightlifting equipment and a mattress on the floor. You knew they were making no money, but he was a guy who literally went from, in 1983, their business closed down, and I don't know that he was on a show that drew 1,500 people, to 1984 working for Jarrett and doing big houses in Memphis and Lexington, and probably still, back then, would he have made $50,000 that year? And in 1985 or 86, he's, in the WWF making fucking hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So he went from the outhouse to the penthouse in 18 months.
The thing that's unique about Randy Savage that kind of needs to just be said is that there are always outlaw groups. Dale TNT Man, to throw a name out there.
Yes.
Running shows, which Randy was on some of his shows. But there's the case of a guy running his own shows. He's the biggest star on his own shows. It just so happened with ICW, they were running their own shows, promoting their own shows, and Randy was, which no one knew, I'm not going to say the best, but one of the best in-ring guys in the entire business, doing things no one else had ever done before. The double axe handle from the top rope to the floor in small shows, all over the South. No one did anything like that. It's amazing, like Hogan said in the documentary, that he never had severe knee injuries from all the things he did.
Until the big severe knee injury from doing the axe handle off top of the cage in a match with Hogan.
Yeah.